rules. For instance, we know that the flight from Cuba is on the scale of the flight from Hitler, larger, as a matter of fact, as a matter of percentage of the national population. We know that conventional and unconventional freedoms don't exist, including certain freedoms that you profess yourself, I'm sure convincingly, as attached to. And yet you admire Castro. What is it about Castro that you find so admirable? And how is it that you permit him to defy your twice a pervert rule, since he's killed twice times 1,000 people?
Oh, well, look, all government leaders kill people. I mean, you know, that you take for granted.
Not all.
Bill, excuse me, Mr. Buckley, we cannot mix these categories. Yeah. If we're talking about murderers, you know, I say I draw the line at one, once
yeah.
philosopher, twice pervert. You want to talk about governments. Governments kill one way or another. They kill in all sorts of ways. I mean, if we get into, we can talk about how people get killed in America. Now, we might part company on it. You might say that they die because they get into automobile accidents. Ralph Nader might say they die because there's been a systematic lack of effort to design cars properly to protect the people who drive them. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
I could say that people die in New York City an incredible rate of lung cancer because the air in the city is no longer fit to breathe. You might say, well, that's part of the 20th century. I might say it's part of the greed and blindness of the American capitalist system.
Yeah, but I think that there's an obvious distinction here that if it escapes you or oughtn't to, which is that one has to distinguish between the quality of the act of somebody who kills somebody in an effort to insist that a society oblige his views of how it ought to proceed, and somebody who simply killed, in a sense, accidentally, as a result of how that particular society evolutionized. I don't think, for instance, that Henry Ford, the discoverer of the automobile, should go down in anybody's history book as the greatest mass murderer of the century, even though more people have been killed by automobiles probably than by almost any other means short of war. This is surely elementary, but not so much so that you...
But I'm not... You're extending my point to a place where it becomes absurd, which is not quite the same thing as my point, which is over here. You know, not all remarks can be extrapolated out to infinity. In fact, most remarks fall off the table
That's
in a
the mark
certain
of the
point.
fanatic, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, anyone who would make that remark about Ford would be a fanatic.
Yeah.
I'm not a fanatic. In fact, I'm trying to extirpate fanaticism in conversation wherever I find it.
Well, you keep curious company under the circumstances.
You mean with Castro? Let's get back to Castro.
Certainly with Castro, also with some of the gang who go around saying that Lyndon Johnson is the greatest mass murderer of the age and all that kind of business.
Well, I'll tell you what I will say about Lyndon Johnson. I'll tell you what I will say about Lyndon Johnson, which is that given this country, given this sort of fine, marvelous country with its extraordinarily agreeable, genial life, you know, in so many ways, with the easiness of life in America, with the prosperity of life in America, the fact that we go around burning children in Asia makes him, in my mind, a murderer of such ominous and abominable propensities that while I would not wish to say he was superior to Hitler in that category, he is a shocking man. That I would say.
Yeah, well, I think it's a pretty shocking thing for you to say under the circumstances. To begin with, incredibly
you mean being your guest
vulgar, to say that we go around burning children in Vietnam. There's a sense in which everyone, I think, ought to be mature enough to recognize that one of the things that makes war despicable is that war is despicable. And if we could have very pleasant wars in which women and children and men over 29 and under 19 were never hurt, and that all deaths should be neat and punctilious, then we might be able to speak about wars in other senses. But the very fact that children get burned in a war is simply an acknowledgement of the fact that children exist. It's an acknowledgement of nothing else than that. Well, and if you're trying to insinuate, then I think you should be apologetic for having done so, that Lyndon Johnson attempts to burn children because this is how he satisfies his perversity.
May I answer
Then
that?
you need to write another book of
I need a couple of minutes to answer that.
Yeah.
Just a couple of minutes. The thought of the case first to me is that there is a way to have the kind of war you talk about, a clean war. War by now, I believe, is fought for image. In other words, short of a nuclear war, in which there would be a real exchange of power, to which one country would finally end up physically dominant over another country, the sort of wars that go on now are really wars which in effect state, keep your peace. We are stronger than you. Do not move in on us. Do not invade. Do not attack. If we could just adopt a little convention to recognize that ground wars by now and air wars, which are short of nuclear wars, are fought for image, we could buy a tract of land in the Amazon.
Why do you call it image? For instance, when Israel tries to rebuff the Arabs, do you call it image
Oh, that was
they
a different war.
designed?
That was an altogether different war. Are we going to talk about all wars
all
being the
wars,
same?
all wars are different except those that you say are the same.
No, no, no. I don't. Well, I'm perfectly.
In the first place, you start out by saying all wars nowadays are fought for image except nuclear wars. So I brought up the Israeli war. Now you say except it. Are you going to wrench everything as inapplicable to your generality?
I said all our wars. All right, I was imprecise. I'll give you that. All our wars are fought for image. All our wars with communism are fought for image. We obviously can't have a war with communism which is going to dominate communism. We're not capable of defeating the communists anymore, and the communists are not capable of defeating us any longer in a ground-air war. It would have to be a nuclear war for one side to win, then obviously, or so it seems, there'd be very little left. Let's go on and finish one point at a time. I don't want to leave all these points left behind, like Castro, Israel, what have you. I have a perfect right to separate wars, to speak of one war as being a good war and another war not being a good war. Because if you don't do that, then you have to argue that all wars are good or all wars are bad. And to test the point of view that says all wars are bad, because then you end up with a sort of with nothing but vegetarians and pacifists. And I think that life is more active than that. And I think that, for instance, I believe, and this is the conservative side of my politics, that a young man who is willing to die for his country is not an ignoble or ridiculous young fellow. I think it's tragic when he's asked to die in a war, which is absurd. Now, you may then say, well, who am I to decide that war in Vietnam is absurd? Well, then we have the argument on that ground, whether that's an absurd war or not.
Which is certainly a ground that I don't funk.
No, you have your opinions on it and I have mine, and if you want to, we can get into that. But what I'm getting at is I don't want to be boxed into a corner where I'm going in through, trying to sweep the food off the table through logical niceties. How's that for a mixed metaphor?
Pretty bad. You were saying, Mr. Mailer.
Well, I wanted to get back on some of the points that we bypassed while we were talking quickly. One of them is my feelings about Castro. To begin with, one of the reasons why the rate of people, not the absolute number, but the rate of people who left Cuba have been greater than those who left Nazi Germany, which I take from you as being factual. It may not be. But if it is, there are a number of reasons for it. One of them is that Castro let them out. He did not keep them from going out. He allowed them to leave. He didn't always allow them to leave, but there was a period where he let them leave.
Well, that's historically inaccurate. Hitler allowed anybody to leave, but he wouldn't allow people to leave with their property. Castro has not allowed anybody to leave with his property and has been extremely erratic in the flow of people that he allows out. For instance, he makes them go to Madrid, which means that anybody who leaves has to be capitalized to the tune of about $800 for a ticket to Madrid on over to North America, which is a form of torture that I don't think you particularly admire.
It's not agreeable. No, I would not admire that. And in fact, if I were ever to talk to him, I would talk to him and say, why do you do that? I wouldn't say cut it out. I'd say, why do you do that?
Yeah. What would he say?
I'd be interested in his reply. It might be different than yours.
I hope so.
But at any rate, the reason I admire him is because the man has a heroic quality, because I believe that Cuba under Batista was far worse than it is today. I think it was an ugly, obscene, disgusting place. I think today, I have a hunch that there are any number of aspects of Cuba that I would detest. I think there'd probably be a fanaticism and a militancy that I wouldn't like.
This is very fashionable. I hear this said very, very often, and I think it is thoughtlessly said. For instance, I hope you remember that the National Review loathed Batista, but under Batista at his worst, there were certain things that you could do. For instance, you could found an opposition newspaper. For instance, you could publish your book. For instance, you could join a labor union. For instance, you could strike. For instance, you could travel in and out of the country. For instance, you could practice your religion freely. Now, it seems to me that here is a list of 6 things which, even up against the personal vulgarity of Batista, made life in Cuba a hell of a lot preferable under him than under his successor.
Well, it certainly did for the middle classes in Cuba. Up to
how about poor people, too? Poor people read books.
Well, no, but there was a very low literacy rate in Cuba. Castro's improved the literacy rate enormously.
Well, you see, enormously, yeah.
Well, I don't have the figures, so I won't say enormously. He certainly has improved it. You won't pretend he hasn't improved
No, I don't pretend that, but for you to say that, after all, poor people don't really need freedom, whether economic or political.
I'm saying the opposite of that.
You're saying that in effect. You say, well, these are middle-class values.
The poor people.
What about joining a labor union? You're supposed to be for that, aren't you?
No, well, that's one point at a time. The poor people never had any freedom under Batista. They had the freedom to starve in one place. They had the freedom to be beaten half to death by the local police.
That isn't true, you know. I gather you think it's true because I'm sure you wouldn't say it otherwise. But in point of fact, it isn't true, you know. The only people who were beaten up by the Batista police were people who wanted to replace him. He was a despot. I don't deny this. But I'm simply saying that since most people do not want to replace the government, And since, in point of fact, it was the middle class who led the movement against Batista, not the lower class, in point of fact, therefore, the lower class enjoyed a great many freedoms which were tangible things to them, which they're not nowadays allowed to enjoy. And for you to goblinize the whole era of the 50s as a period during which the poor people just simply had half a banana a day and spent the rest of the time in prison, it's just plain inaccurate. It's melodrama of the kind that makes it much easier for you to justify, again, the Mailer expiation. You're having subscribed to a committee which was bankrolled by Castro himself, it turns out, called the Fair Play for Castro Committee. It's these myopias of yours that make you less than a reliable witness. You're a wonderful writer, but a terrible witness.
Well, are you done? The point that I get back to is why I think Castro's a great man. Great men are great men because they have the imagination to seize a moment in their history and embody it and move a country from one condition to another. It's then left for the likes of you and me to debate the points of whether the country's been improved or has not improved. I could answer everything you've said by saying there's an extraordinary spirit in Cuba today. There's an atmosphere of hope that from many of the things I've heard.
Nazi Germany, too.
Well, we could get into that, too, if we had time. Sometimes a country can feel great hope and not be moving in a good direction, be moving in a hideous direction. Sometimes a country can be moving in a hideous direction and feel great hope because the entire world is upset.
Yeah, sure.
You know, I mean, the world is heading toward an abyss.
I think Cuba's
and any
any
orgy of killing releases releases positive emotions because people feel animal again and alive, whereas modern technological society is destroying them. But all I'm getting at is these are enormous points. But the one point I do want to make is that Castro had the ability to fight the 20th century, and that's why I admire him profoundly. When he landed in Cuba to take to try to take Cuba away from Batista, he landed with 80 men. 68 of them were killed in the first couple of days. They were without food for 5 days, wandering at night. At a certain point on the 5th day, he turned to the other people and he said, "The days of the dictatorship are numbered." And the man who reported said, "I thought our leader was mad." Well, of course, he was mad unless he succeeded. You see, many a man says something like that on such an occasion. He succeeded, which meant that he had, the man has a greatness which nobody on the right wing has ever been willing to allow him. By the same token, de Gaulle has a greatness. De Gaulle had the ability to see that the only way France was going to be able to...
Do you know why I disagree with you? For this very reason, that expeditions of this kind are not uncommon in this century or in others. And I join with you in admiring the quality of the stubborn idealism of the people who join in these expeditions. But in point of fact, it's not, as a general rule, they who make them successful. It's historical and accidental events that decide whether or not Castro is going to descend from the Sierra Maestra. For instance, if it had been that a particular sharpshooter had actually sighted Castro.
They didn't.
But the fact that it was pure accident.
I don't believe it was pure accident.
It was an accident that John Kennedy was shot and Franklin Delano Roosevelt wasn't by the assassin who killed Cermak instead.
Well, of course we get into that.
This does make Oswald a man of history in the sense in which you're talking about.
Well, then we don't know that Oswald did the killing altogether, do we?
I do.
Well, see, I don't. Every time you speak or I speak, we open a can of beans.
Yeah.
The floor is littered with beans by now.